The first sign Tobias Hartwell noticed was the crows. 3 of them, circling low over the north fence line like black scraps of wind-tossed cloth, their ragged cries carrying across the brittle afternoon air. Out here, nothing flew lazy unless it was waiting for something to die. He set down the fence post he'd been shaping, wiping his hands on the thighs of his worn denims, and squinted into the sun's glare. His ranch stretched out for miles in every direction, a patchwork of dusty pasture and brittle scrub, broken only by the sagging lines of cedar posts he'd hammered into the ground with his own hands. A man came to know every inch of such land. He could tell you which fence post leaned most in the wind, which patch of soil would choke a seed before it sprouted. And he knew, down to the marrow, that there was fresh trouble waiting at the north end. By the time he reached the far pasture, the air was heavy with that metallic tang he'd smelled too many times in his life. Blood. It wasn't from an animal. The trail led right up to the post and wire fence, where a spatter had dried into rust-colored stains on the top rail. From there, it wound toward the old stone well, a short run of wet, uneven dots in the dirt, each one more hurried than the last. Tobias followed it around the corner of the barn, his rifle already loose in his hands. That's when he saw him, a young Apache warrior slumped against the well's stone base, knees drawn halfway to his chest, one hand clamped over his side in a way that told Tobias more than any words could. The other hand stretched toward the bucket that hung just out of reach above his head. His dark hair stuck to a sweat-slick face, and his eyes, clouded with pain but sharp enough to track every movement, locked on Tobias the instant he appeared. This was 1847. An Indian on your property was bad enough. A wounded one was an invitation to die in your sleep. Every neighbor Tobias had left would have said the same thing. Put a bullet in him, roll him in the ravine, and tell no one. But something in those eyes stopped him cold. They weren't the eyes of a raider caught mid-plunder, or the glassy look of a dying man resigned to meet his maker. No, Tobias recognized the same desperate thirst that had clawed at his own throat in the drought of '44, when the riverbed cracked open like old pottery, and men started digging graves before the bodies cooled. The stranger tried to speak, but all that came out was a single, rasped word: water. Tobias's finger hesitated on the trigger. It would have been easy, expected, to walk away, to leave him to the crows. But Tobias Hartwell had lived alone for 12 years, and somewhere along the line, solitude had taught him a dangerous thing. A man who forgets mercy becomes something less than human. He lowered the rifle. A minute later, the wooden bucket was in the stranger's hands, and the sound of his drinking was almost obscene in its need. The water ran down his chin, soaking the front of a shirt that was already stiff with blood. He drained it once, twice, 3 times before his trembling fingers could finally hold the rim steady. When the warrior pulled the bucket away, color had crept back into his face. But so had clarity. That's when Tobias saw the wound for what it was, a bullet hole. Fresh. The powder burns around the edges said it had been fired close, almost point blank. Whoever had put that lead in him hadn't been interested in a warning shot. Tobias's jaw tightened. If the shooter had followed the trail this far, they were close, and they'd see the blood leading straight to his door. The warrior's gaze flicked toward the horizon, then back to Tobias. He made a slicing motion across his own throat. His meaning was clear enough. Danger coming. Fast. And then Tobias heard it. Hoofbeats. Far off at first, just a dull shiver in the hard-pan earth beneath his boots. But growing louder, closer, Riders moving hard and fast. Not a neighbor out on an errand. Not a cattle drive. A hunt. He scanned the fence line and counted the beats. 5 horses, maybe 6. If they were who he thought they were, they'd arrive in minutes. The warrior tried to push himself upright, but the effort made fresh blood seep between his fingers. He slumped again, teeth gritted against the pain, and gave Tobias a look that could have been plea or warning. Leaving him here meant those riders would find him and finish the job. Helping him meant Tobias would be branded a collaborator, maybe hung without trial. So before we ride straight into the fire, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if frontier stories speak to your soul. Tobias cursed under his breath, slung his rifle across his back, and hauled the stranger to his feet. The man's weight sagged heavily against him, but Tobias had dragged fence posts through worse ground. The root cellar behind the barn might buy them time, if they moved now. They had just reached the cellar door when the hoofbeats broke over the ridge, sharp and close enough that Tobias could hear the jingle of tack. He risked a glance around the barn. 6 riders spread across the rise, dust pluming behind them. Leading the pack was a man Tobias recognized instantly, Dixon Webb, a federal marshal with ice water in his veins and the law twisted to his own liking. Webb's pale eyes swept the land like a hawk's, hunting for a single wounded man worth more dead than alive. Tobias felt the ground tremble beneath the marshal's approach, and in that moment, he knew. Whatever was coming down from that ridge wasn't just trouble. It was the kind of trouble that changed a man's life forever. Webb brought his horse down the slope at an easy lope, like a man arriving for a neighborly call. The 5 behind him fanned out without being told, muzzles angled low, eyes scanning the yard the way buzzards study a carcass. They stopped 20 paces from the well. Heat shimmered above the hard pan, and the shadows of rider and horse stretched long, folded over the fence line like dark hands reaching. Tobias eased the cellar door shut with his heel and stood up alone, wiping dust from his palms onto his denims as if he'd just finished a chore. He let his rifle hang lazy in the crook of his arm and forced his shoulders loose. Men like Webb smelled panic. It was how they'd learned to live better than decent folks. "Mr. Hartwell," Webb called, sunlight flaring off the small star pinned to his vest. He smiled without warmth. "Afternoon. You look busy." "Always something needs fixing," Tobias answered. The words came flat and measured. "Marshal." Webb's gaze slid along the barn, the house, the corn crib, small touches of a life carved out of stubborn ground. "We're tracking a wounded Indian," he said, reining closer. The horse's breath plumed. The iron bit ticked against yellow teeth. "Blood trail says he came through here. You seen anything you'd want to tell the law about?" Behind Tobias, the well stones baked like old bread. Beneath the earth, a man bled into his own shirt and tried not to die. Tobias felt that knowledge, like a second heartbeat, thudding under the soles of his boots. "No Indians," he said. He kept his eyes on Webb, not the dirt, not the scabbed flecks near the bucket rope he hadn't had time to scrub. Only crows and a fence that keeps leaning wrong. One of the deputies, a red-cheeked kid with fear already sweating his hat band, leaned out of his saddle. "Marshal, there's blood yonder by the stones." Webb didn't look at the kid. He looked at Tobias and let silence do the work. Then he swung down, boots raising 2 small puffs of dust when they met the ground. He stepped to the well, ran 2 fingers across a stain, and rubbed them together thoughtfully. "Fresh," he said. "Smells like truth." He lifted his hand to his nose and smiled again. And lies. The other riders dismounted. The semicircle tightened. Someone worked a lever, another thumbed back a hammer, and left it at half-cock. It was a quiet chorus that said more than shouting would have. "Walk me through your day, Hartwell," Webb went on, sauntering as if inspecting a garden. "Where you been? What you done? Who came calling? Who left crying?" Tobias's mouth was dry. He heard, distantly, the cellar's wood grain contracting with heat. He thought of the choice kneeling at his feet an hour ago, and the one standing in front of him now. Mercy was simple when the sun was high, and a man had water in his hand. It turned harder under a badge. "Post-hole work," he said. "South fence, then north. No callers." Webb turned his face toward the low hills where the dust still hung from their ride. His pale eyes went thin. "Funny, blood says different." He let the words rest, then added, "Lift the cellar door." The earth seemed to tilt. Tobias shifted his weight to hide it. "I've got nothing under there but potatoes." "I like potatoes," Webb said. He scratched his jaw with the edge of his badge, watching Tobias watch him. "Lift it." Tobias didn't move. "A man's home is his line," he said softly. "Crossing it should cost something." For a heartbeat, the yard held its breath. Then Webb's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You set the price when you hit a fugitive." His voice hardened by a degree that was more chilling than a shout. "Deputies." The cellar latch clicked from below. It was faint, easily lost under the rasp of crickets and the whisper of leather. But every man in the yard heard it because every man was listening for something to go wrong. One deputy flinched, another cursed. Webb didn't move at all. His head turned just enough to register the sound as fact, not surprise. He drew his pistol, slow, smooth, as if scraping butter off bread, and leveled it at the door. Tobias stepped, putting himself in the line without thinking. The muzzle found his chest instead. "Don't make me count to one," Webb said. "I'm short-tempered today." From below, a voice spoke. The words came up through wood and dust, low and liquid, syllables that belonged to the river and the stones before the ranch ever had a fence. Tobias had heard Apache spoken on the wind and in raids. He'd never heard it sound like that. Measured, commanding, a man choosing when to breathe. Something happened in Webb's face. The pistol didn't lower, but his eyes broke, flicked sideways, then back. The deputies shifted uneasily the way horses do when a snake moves under brush. Again the voice, stronger. The tone asked a question with no room for lying. Webb swallowed. The muscles in his jaw went tight as pig iron. Then, reluctantly, as if each word cost more than he'd saved, he answered in the same tongue. Not well, not fluid, but enough that meaning bridged the space like a plank across a creek. Tobias didn't understand the language, but he understood the shape of fear when it got into a man who thought he'd wrung it out of himself. It crawled out of Webb now, quiet but visible, a shattuck under the skin. The cellar hatch lifted a hand's breadth. A strip of darkness widened to reveal a pair of eyes the color of wet walnut wood. Sweat slicked the man's brow, but his gaze was steady, sober. He spoke once more, this time in English that carried the careful weight of someone who had learned it to be believed. "Tell him my name," he said to Webb, "so he knows what he is about to do." Webb's finger tightened a fraction on the trigger. He didn't lower the gun. He didn't speak. For a long 2 seconds, he let everyone hang on the edge he occupied, alone. Then his shoulders flattened, as if some private ledger in his head had just put a red line under the total. "Ayana," he said, barely louder than a prayer, "son of Chief Takakota." His gaze cut to his men. The treaty maker of Fort Richardson. Even the red-cheeked kid knew that name. The semicircle wavered, not backward exactly, but inward, as if each man had suddenly become heavier on his own feet. A sparrow shot from the eaves, and the whole yard jumped like a single creature. Ayana's eyes did not leave Webb. "You were sent to kill me," he said, "not to bring me." Webb's mouth twitched again, uglier this time. "I was sent to end a war that should never have paused," he replied, and there it was, something raw and true enough to scorch his tongue. He amended, colder, "You're wanted for Colonel Morrison's murder. Dead will travel easier than alive." "Colonel Morrison," Ayana said, and the ache in his voice had iron under it. "The man who wrote me a letter the night before he died." Tobias felt the pivot. He saw it pass through the deputies like a wind nobody could name, curiosity battling the safety of ignorance. He knew that wind. He'd stood in it the morning he buried his wife and decided to outlive the ache. Webb noticed it, too. "Hold steady," he snapped, without looking, but the snap told on him. He broke the line, the first mistake men like him made when the ground changed beneath them. Ayana pushed the hatch farther. Blood soaked his shirt at the hip, a dark flower spreading. In one shaking hand he held a folded scrap, edges gone brown with old wet. He lifted it so Webb could see without taking his eyes off any man with a gun. "Truth makes poor kindling," Ayana said. "It refuses to burn." "Put that away," Webb hissed, and then, catching himself, forced calm back into his tone. "Paper won't help you. The courts won't see it. The army won't care." "The people might," Tobias said, surprised to find his voice still worked. He took a small step left to get eyes off the hatch and onto him. "And the men standing here might like to know whether they aim a gun for pay or for justice." One deputy, broad-shouldered, sunburnt nose, shifted his stance. His hand fell from his pistol to hang open at his side, fingers twitching as if they wanted to hold something honest for the first time all day. The kid swallowed so hard, Tobias heard it. "Listen close," Webb said, louder now, speaking to the circle without turning from Ayana. "This man is a murderer. He killed an officer under flag of meeting." Ayana didn't blink. "I met Morrison under flag. Others met us under paint and lies. They wore our words on their mouths and put army bullets in his back." "If that were true," Webb said, "I'd know it." "You do," Ayana said simply. "That is why your hands shake." They did not really. But the sentence worked through the men like a pry bar under a nailed plank. The kid's eyes slid to Webb's fingers. The broad-shouldered deputy stared at the badge and saw something it had covered for too long. Moral tension drew tight as a cinch rope. If Webb ordered fire, 6 guns would answer out of habit and fear, and a war would restart before sundown. If he hesitated, the shape of his authority might buckle in front of men who wore its shadow every day. "Last time," Webb said, "hand over the Indian. Lift the door and step aside. Do that, and you'll live to mend fence tomorrow." Tobias stared at him. In the blur of heat haze, he could see his ranch, the way it had been the morning he staked the first post, when he still believed a quiet life could be built with tired hands and good water. He saw, too, the cellar and the man under it, and the line he'd crossed by offering a drink. "I don't bargain with a rope," he said. "Not even mine." Webb's eyes went flat. The pistol rose a hair. A hawk cut the sky overhead, throwing a crisp moving shadow across Webb's face, the clean silhouette of wings passing over a man who had none. For an instant, the whole yard looked carved in glass, the soldiers' knuckles white on their guns, the well stones bright enough to burn the eye, the letter in Ayana's hand catching a single hot coin of sun. "Then God help you," Webb said, somewhere down valley. Thunder murmured. Too distant to cool the air, close enough to promise the ground would tremble before night. The air between them was stretched thin, like the hide of a war drum before the first strike. Webb's pale eyes flickered between Ayana's blood-stained hand, clutching the letter, and the deputies who were no longer quite standing behind him. Tobias could feel the shift. It wasn't loud, but it was dangerous. Years of hard riding and harder living had taught him that trouble didn't always come with shouting or drawn guns. Sometimes it began in the silence, in the way a man's jaw tightened, or his boot heel angled toward the open trail. Ayana's breath was shallow but steady. "This isn't just about me, Marshal. It's about every life this treaty saved, about every child who didn't grow up to see his home burned to the ground." His words weren't just for Webb. They were for the men around him, and Tobias knew it. Deputy Bradley cleared his throat. "Marshal, I reckon we ought to read that letter before we decide." Webb cut him off like a whip crack. "You reckon wrong, son. You think I don't know what's in there? It's poison, and the first man who lays eyes on it is dead before sunset." The words hit like a slap. The youngest deputy flinched. The oldest shifted his stance, hand loosening near his Colt. Webb's grip on the situation was slipping, but like a wounded wolf, that only made him more dangerous. Ayana tilted his head slightly, eyes never leaving Webb. "You talk about orders, but whose orders? Morrison was your friend once. You shared a fire, rode against Comanche together, and now you hunt the man he trusted most." That hit something. Webb's nostrils flared, and for an instant, the ice in his expression cracked. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the stony mask of a man who had chosen his side long before he ever rode out here. "You don't know the first thing about what I've done to keep this territory together," Webb said, voice low and sharp. "You sit in your council lodges making promises while I scrape what's left of men off the dirt." "And you call that justice?" Ayana asked. No one moved. No one breathed. Then Ayana shifted against the well stone, grimacing as the wound pulled. "You're not here because of justice. You're here because peace doesn't line your pockets. War does. And men like you don't fight for law. They fight for the men who own the law." That did it. Webb's face darkened, the faint tremor of a man on the edge. His hand closed over his revolver grip until the leather creaked. Tobias knew if Webb drew, the ground would be slick with blood in seconds. The deputies were too close, too tense. All it would take was one twitch. Ayana broke the tension in the most dangerous way possible, by speaking the truth no one wanted to hear. "The letter names you, Webb." The marshal froze. Gasps rose from the men behind him. "It says you cleared the trails for those rifle shipments, that you were paid in gold to keep your eyes shut while the war parties were armed. Morrison wanted you hanged for it." Webb's jaw worked silently. Tobias could see the old instinct flaring behind the man's eyes, the urge to silence the speaker before the words could take root. But Bradley stepped forward, boots crunching in the dirt. "Marshal, if that's true, boy, you'll be rotting in the ground before you can finish that thought." Webb's voice was a snarl now. Tobias caught a flicker in Ayana's eyes. A calculation, a decision. The man was gambling, and the stakes were all their lives. He reached into his pouch again, slowly, like a man handling a rattler, and drew out the folded letter. His fingers trembled from blood loss, but his voice was calm. "Take it, Bradley. If I fall, get it to the council. Ride hard and ride fast." Bradley hesitated only a heartbeat before stepping closer. Webb moved like lightning, his revolver clearing leather in a single smooth motion. And Tobias was already moving. He didn't think. There was no time for thought. His shoulder hit Webb hard, shoving the man sideways, the revolver's shot going wide and kicking up dirt near the well. In that instant, the deputies scattered, some to draw, some to cover, none quite knowing which side they'd chosen yet. The dust boiled up around them, hot and dry in Tobias's throat. Webb came up from the ground like a man possessed, eyes burning, revolver rising again. "Drop it," Tobias barked, his own Winchester leveled at Webb's chest. For a moment, just a moment, the marshal hesitated. Tobias could see the weight of years in the man's face, every choice that had brought him here, every piece of himself he'd sold. Then Webb smiled, and it wasn't the smile of a man about to surrender. "Boys," he said softly, "you've got no idea what you've just stepped into." The dust swirled between them, turning men into half-shapes, all steel and sweat, and the twitch of trigger fingers. Tobias had the Winchester steady on Webb, but it felt like pointing a match at a powder keg. The real danger wasn't just the man in his sights, but the 6 others deciding whether to strike flint. Webb's voice cut through the grit in the air. "Step aside, Hartwell. That letter goes into the ground with him." "No," Tobias said. One word, flat as an anvil. The deputy's eyes were shifting like marbles in a tilted pan, first to Webb, then to Tobias, then to Ayana, who stood braced against the well-stone, pale but unbowed. His left hand pressed his wound, his right still clutching Morrison's letter like it was the spine that kept him standing. Bradley spoke first. "Marshal, if the colonel wrote that—" "I said step back," Webb barked, the revolver jerking toward the young deputy. That single motion turned the air electric. In an instant, every man's weapon came an inch higher, a heartbeat closer to killing range. Tobias knew this was the knife's edge. Webb wasn't just fighting for his authority. He was fighting to keep the truth from breathing, and truth had a way of making men change sides. "You shoot him," Tobias said, "and you'll have to shoot me, and maybe 2 or 3 more before the rest of these boys decide which way they're riding." Webb's eyes narrowed. "You think they'll follow you, a rancher who can't mind his own fence?" "I think they'll follow what's right," Tobias said, but even as he said it, he knew right didn't always win. Sometimes it just survived long enough to be told again. The big deputy, Murdoch, shifted his weight forward. "Marshal, I signed up to uphold the law, not bury it in the dirt." His voice was low, but it carried. If the colonel was killed to start a war. Webb swung the revolver toward him now, and that was the crack in the dam. "You point that at me," Murdoch said. "You'd best pull the trigger, because I'll only give you the one chance." Ayana's voice slid into the moment like a blade between ribs, measured, dangerous. "Let me walk to my people. If I fall on the way, then the war comes honest. But if I live, there's still a chance for peace." "No," Webb snapped. "You die here, now. That's the only way this ends clean." Tobias felt the weight of it then. If Ayana died here, Webb would ride away with his story clean and the land soaked in another man's blood. If Ayanna lived, the truth might still breathe. But getting him there meant every man here would be hunted. He looked at the barn, at the house beyond, at the fence lines he'd built with his own hands. Everything he'd worked for sat quiet in the sun, waiting for him to choose between the land and the man. "You'll never make it to the council," Webb said, reading his silence. "He's a dead weight. You drag him off, you both die in the brush." Tobias didn't answer Webb. He looked at Murdoch, at Bradley, at the youngest deputy whose hands still trembled near his Colt. "If you believe in the law more than the man wearing the badge, then draw that line now. Choose which side of it you're standing on." For a moment, no one moved. Then Murdoch stepped to Tobias's side. Bradley followed. The kid hesitated, then edged closer, eyes darting between Webb and Ayanna. The standoff tilted. Webb's face went hard as dried clay. "You've signed your own death warrants." "Maybe," Tobias said, "but at least our names won't be on that letter for the wrong reason." The marshal's knuckles whitened on his gun, but he saw it too. The odds had shifted. Killing Ayanna now meant killing half his own men in broad daylight. He spat into the dirt. "Fine. You want him? Then you'd better be ready to die for him." He holstered the revolver slow, but his eyes promised this was far from finished. Without another word, he swung into the saddle, motioning for the two deputies still loyal to him to follow. As they rode off toward the ridge, the ground seemed to breathe again, but the weight in Tobias's chest didn't lift. He turned to Ayanna, who was already struggling to his feet. "You heard him? He'll be back." Ayanna nodded once. "Then we must move faster than his hate." And somewhere deep in Tobias's gut, he knew that whatever side of the line he'd chosen, there was no going back now. They left before the dust of Webb's departure settled, moving along the back trail that wound behind the mesquite scrub. Ayanna rode Murdoch's horse, swaying in the saddle, the blood on his shirt turning from bright to brown. Bradley kept scanning the horizon. Tobias counted every hoofbeat, knowing each one brought them closer to the ridge and farther from the safety of his own ground. They didn't make 5 miles before the sky told them Webb wasn't done. It began as a tremor in the heat haze, dark dots on the far rim of the valley multiplying like ants on sugar. Then the sun caught rifle barrels, and the dots turned into horsemen, 20 at least, strung wide across the ridgeline. The sound followed, low and steady, like distant thunder. Bradley spat. Reinforcements. Tobias didn't need telling. He knew Webb's kind. The man would rather bring an army than risk losing face in a fair fight. "Ridge cuts us off to the north," Murdoch said. "Only other way is through the valley, and they'll be on us before we clear it." Tobias looked past the valley's dry flats to the far slope, where the stream cut a silver thread down from the high rocks. His stomach tightened. Above that stream sat a dam, old, built in the early days when settlers had needed to hold back the spring floods for planting. Tobias had helped repair it twice. He knew exactly what would happen if the keystone supports gave way. Water would roar down the valley floor, churning mud, stone, and timber into a wall strong enough to wipe men and horses clean off the earth. It would also drown every acre he owned, his grazing pasture, his corral, the south fence line, all gone. Ayanna caught his glance and seemed to read it. "You know another way?" Tobias hesitated. "There's a way to make the valley impassable." Murdoch's eyes narrowed. "You talking about the dam?" Tobias nodded once. "I can drop it. We'd get to the high ridge before the water hits." "And everything below it?" Bradley asked. Tobias didn't answer. The truth was in his face. Ayanna shifted in the saddle, watching him. That would cost you your home. It'd buy you your life, Tobias said. For a long moment, no one spoke. The hoofbeats from the ridge were growing louder now. The riders were starting their descent into the valley. This is your choice, Ayanna said quietly, not mine. I will walk into that valley if you ask it, and I will fight to the last breath. But I will not take your land from you. Tobias almost laughed, bitter, dry. Land don't mean much if it's the ground you die on. Bradley shifted in his saddle. If we ride hard, maybe we make the far pass before they close the trap. They've got fresh horses, Murdoch said. We won't outrun 'em. Tobias looked up at the sun. It was leaning west, painting the rock face above the dam in gold. In his mind, he saw every fence post, every cattle brand, every quiet morning with coffee on the porch. And then he saw Webb's pale eyes and the letter in Ayanna's hand. I built this place once, Tobias said. I can't build another Ayanna. Decision settled in him like a stone dropped into a well. We ride to the dam, he said. They spurred hard, cutting across the scrub until the land began to rise. Behind them, Webb's riders fanned into the valley floor, dust boiling up in their wake. Shots cracked, the rounds whining through the air, but they were still too far for clean killing. The dam loomed ahead, thick timber, chinked with stone, the stream gurgling over the spillway. Tobias slid down, pulling the canvas-wrapped sticks of dynamite from the pack Murdoch carried. He kept them for blasting stubborn stumps, never thinking they'd be the tools to end his life's work. You know what you're doing? Bradley asked. Enough to make it count, Tobias said, jamming the charges into the support joints. Ayanna watched from the saddle, breathing ragged, eyes on the valley below. They're coming fast. Tobias struck a match, the sulfur burning sharp in his nose. For an instant, the memory of the ranch washed over him. Morning light on the barn, the creak of the windmill, the low bellow of cattle. Then he touched flame to fuse. The hiss began, steady and merciless. Up the slope. Tobias barked, swinging into his saddle. They drove the horses up the rocky incline, the fuse burning down behind them. Webb's riders were a dark tide on the valley floor now, 50 yards from the dam and closing. The first blast came like a thunderclap, rattling Tobias's teeth. Wood and stone burst apart, the water behind it lunging forward in a white froth. A heartbeat later, the second charge ripped the keystone free, and the dam collapsed with a roar that drowned every other sound. Water surged down the valley, devouring earth and sky in its fury. Horses screamed, men shouted, then the floods swallowed them whole. From the ridge, Tobias watched the torrent rip through the low ground, tearing away pasture and corral alike. His ranch was gone, but Ayanna was alive beside him, and Webb, if he'd been down there, was gone with the rest. The ground still trembled under the weight of it, but the choice was made. There was no turning back now. The roar of the water was a living thing, deeper than thunder, wider than the sky. From the high ridge, Tobias could see the flood boiling through the valley, slamming against rock and timber, lifting whole cottonwoods from the earth like weeds. Men and horses alike were swallowed, vanishing in a churn of white and brown. But Webb was not among them. A flash of movement on the far slope caught Tobias's eye, a rider cutting up from the valley's edge, soaked to the bone, but still in the saddle. The pale glint of a badge at his chest told Tobias everything. Webb had been high enough to outrun the first wall of water, circling toward them even as the dam gave way. "He's coming," Murdoch said, spitting into the dust. His voice was half admiration, half dread. "And he ain't alone." 2 more riders followed Webb, faces grim, rifles ready. They were climbing fast, angling to cut Tobias's group off before they could reach the next pass. Ayanna swayed in his saddle, clutching his side. "Leave me," he rasped. "Take the letter and ride. If he gets it, all this—" He gestured to the drowned valley. "The smoke of the ruined dam is for nothing." Tobias shook his head. "Not leaving you." Bradley glanced between them, jaw tight. "We can't outrun him with him bleeding like that." Tobias's gaze fell to the dynamite pouch still slung across his saddle. 2 sticks left. Enough to make Webb think twice. Or enough to end it. "Get Ayanna to cover," Tobias said, swinging down. "Murdoch, with me." They scrambled up the rock face, moving toward a narrow cut in the ridge. Below, Webb and his men closed in, the marshal's pale eyes locked on Tobias like a hawk on a rabbit. "Webb!" Tobias's voice carried across the gap, raw and sharp. "It ends here." The marshal reined in, 20 yards off, his horse stamping at the uneven ground. He looked at the pouch in Tobias's hand, then at the flood still raging below. "You've already lost everything you own," Webb called back. "Don't throw your life in with it." "You took my home," Tobias said. "You won't take the truth." Webb's smile was a knife's edge. "Truth doesn't matter if no one lives to speak it." He spurred forward, gun rising, and Tobias lit the first fuse. The explosion was close, the shockwave slamming into him like a mule's kick. Rock and dust filled the air, and one of Webb's riders went down screaming, his horse tumbling into the chasm. But Webb pushed through the haze, firing wild. A round tore the air past Tobias's ear. Another sparked off the stone beside him. Murdoch fired back, catching the second rider in the shoulder, spinning him from the saddle. That left Webb. He came on foot now, climbing the last stretch with murder in his eyes. Tobias met him halfway, the 2 of them colliding in a crash of fists and elbows. The revolver went skittering across the rock. Webb's hand found Tobias's throat. Tobias drove his knee up hard, breaking the hold. They grappled on the ridge's edge, boots scraping at loose stone. Below them, the valley boiled. Above, the sun blazed hot on the rock, turning sweat into salt in their eyes. Webb drew a knife from his belt, the blade catching the light. "Should have stayed out of this, Hartwell." Tobias caught his wrist, the knife hovering inches from his chest. "Maybe, but then I'd still be the kind of man you can scare." He twisted hard, the blade clattering to the stone. In the same motion, he shoved Webb back, just enough. The marshal's heel found empty air. His eyes went wide, and then he was gone, swallowed by the roaring flood below. Silence fell, broken only by the water's distant rage. Tobias stood there a moment, chest heaving, before turning to see Murdoch helping Ayanna into the shade of the rocks. The Apache's face was pale, but the letter was still in his hand. "It's over," Murdoch said. Tobias shook his head. "Not until that reaches the council." They turned away from the drowned valley, and the body it now held, the wind carrying the smell of wet earth and something darker. The reckoning was done, but the ride ahead would decide if it meant anything. By dawn, the valley had gone quiet. The flood had drained to a sluggish brown ribbon, strewn with splintered timber and the carcasses of horses. Here and there, the glint of a rifle barrel or the pale curve of a face broke the surface before the current took it away. Tobias stood at the ridge edge, hat in hand. Below, what had once been his pasture lay under a quilt of silt and wreckage. The barn roof had been carried 1/2 mile downstream. The corral fence was nothing but twisted rails lodged in the mud. It didn't look like land anymore. It looked like a memory that had been drowned and left to rot. Murdoch came up beside him, carrying 2 canteens. "Scouts will be here by nightfall," he said. "Webb had friends in high places. They'll want to know why their man never came back." Tobias nodded, eyes still on the valley. "Then we ride before they have something to follow." Behind them, Ayanna sat by the fire they'd built in a cleft of rock, his wound cleaned and bandaged as best they could manage. The letter lay in his lap, weighted at the corners with small stones so the wind wouldn't take it. He looked up as Tobias approached. "You've lost more than I can give back." "Wasn't for you to give," Tobias said. He sat across from him, the fire's smoke curling between them. "Land's just dirt, unless it stands for something." Ayanna studied him a long moment. "When I reach the council, I will tell them what you've done. But know this, truth alone may not stop the war." "I figured as much," Tobias said, "but it might make some men think twice before they start it." Bradley saddled the horses in silence. The youngest deputy, now looking older than he had 2 days ago, kept glancing toward the valley, like he still couldn't believe what he'd seen. They broke camp as the sun climbed, heading south toward the mountains. The trail was rough, but it would take Ayanna closer to his people without crossing open ground. Murdoch and Bradley rode as flank guards, their eyes sharp for dust on the horizon. At the last rise before the trail bent east, Tobias reined in. From here, he could see the whole of the drowned valley, the sun flashing on the thin line of water that remained. He thought of the first day he'd set foot here, when the grass was tall and the air smelled of rain. He thought of the mornings alone with coffee and the windmill's creak, of fence posts set in sweat and stubbornness. All gone now. Ayanna stopped beside him. You could still turn back, try to rebuild. Tobias shook his head. A man spends his life building one thing. He starts thinking it's the only thing he can do. I need to prove myself wrong. Ayanna extended his hand, slow and deliberate. Tobias took it, feeling the strength still in the man despite the wound. "Whatever happens next," Ayanna said, "you've bought time for the truth to breathe." "Let's hope it's enough," Tobias replied. They rode on until the land folded them into shadow, and the drowned valley was just another scar on the horizon. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning chill. Somewhere behind them the law would come riding again, looking for someone to hang. But for now, there was only the trail, the letter, and the fragile hope it carried. Justice rides fast, but sometimes mercy rides faster. The trail behind them would fill with dust soon enough, just as the valley would fill with stories, half of them lies, the other half too heavy to carry far. Men would say Tobias Hartwell was a fool, throwing away a lifetime's work for a wounded stranger. Others would whisper he'd done what they wished they'd had the grit to do themselves. The truth, like most things worth keeping, would live somewhere in the space between. Tobias didn't ride for thanks, and he didn't ride for forgiveness. He rode because something in him refused to let the badge, or the gun, or the money that moved them both decide who lived and who didn't. Ayanna carried the letter now, but Tobias carried the weight. Of the ranch, of the men lost in the flood, of the thin hope that maybe peace could outlast greed just long enough to matter. The mountains ahead were steep, The passes narrow, but the air was clean, and each hoofbeat put more distance between them and the drowned valley. Somewhere over the next ridge, the sun would rise again, and the land would be new in the way land always is to those who've left something behind.